I started recording. One second. Okay, we started recording. So Amy, take it away. Remember to unmute yourself before you take it away.
Thank you. I was trying to find the unmute button the whole time. And so thank you guys for having me here. I'm not sure, I forgot to ask you, how many people are logged in? Oh, I can see up here, 29. Thank you all for being here. And so I'm Amy Hoover. I'm an assistant professor at the New Jersey Institute of Technology in the Department of Informatics. And I'll be talking about procedural content generation in Hearthstone today. Uh-oh. There we go. So a little bit about me. I included a picture since you weren't going to be able to see me. And this is me and the next speaker, actually, Yoros Yannakakis, who I was fortunate to work with for a postdoc at the University of Malta for a year, and then went on to do 2 years at Northeastern University. And so my background is in computer science, and today I'll be talking about some of the research I've done with AI and content generation. My dissertation focused mostly on music from a neural network perspective, I should say, and I've moved on to games in the last few years. So here are some card games that I collected pictures of. Some are more complex than others, as you can see. You see Uno in the upper left-hand corner, Cards Against Humanity. The box looks really nice in the middle. You have Hearthstone and the Pokemon card game, Magic, of course, and card games like poker. And then there are games like Clash Royale that have, which is this, I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but it's in this lower left-hand corner. Clash Royale has these collectible card game like mechanics where you have certain, yes, excellent, thank you. It has these collectible card game like mechanics where you have to select a subset from some set of cards that you get to play, and you don't have access to these other cards while you're playing any given game. So, okay, that's what we're talking about generally when we're thinking of card games, but there have been some pretty interesting approaches to card games from a PCG perspective, and this isn't a complete survey, it's just a couple cool approaches that I happen to know of. And so if you have others that you think are pretty interesting, I didn't tell you what my email address is, but it was on the first slide. It's ahoover@njit.edu, and I would love to see more approaches if you have some that you would want to send me. Anyway, this is a really cool project that was published at AID in 2016 called Mystical Tutor that was generating more or less an autocomplete for Magic cards. And so they created this tutor that was auto-completing the cards, and they were looking at these different features like the name, subtype, type, and I'm sure you can read all these different things. And so they broke the problem into generating these subfields. And I suggest for more information about the approach to read this paper. But they did use an LSTM, and they had as an input some sort of partial description of the card, and as output a full description. And so their data set was they looked at all 13,651 at the time of the project Magic cards. They put in duplicates of the cards, and they mutated about a third to try and beef up their data set a little bit. And so if you look at these two arrows here, these are two sets of autocomplete from a partial description. And so on the left, you can see there's a little bit of information here. And on the right, you can see that this has been filled in, and you now know it's a creature. And so it's a plausible card, but the devoid right here is redundant. But it is something that possibly could work in the game. Although it's not something, from my understanding, that they were able to test in any kind of simulator to explore the dynamics. And so, but you have something as well on the right-hand side where we start with an incomplete card and we generate a complete card. And so I don't play Magic, so I'm going off of the description of the results in the paper. But hopefully if you do, you can see that this card has a lot of features. And so too many attributes to make it a likely card that somebody would play. And so flying and lifelink are common for vampires, but there is a discard ability in there that is not so common for vampires, but is related to the is related to this idea of vampires using black abilities. And so this is not explicitly a game, but I had students, I was teaching a creative AI course the past 2 semesters, looking at deep learning approaches for more artistic domains. And so I had my students generate Pokemon with what's called a generative adversarial neural network. And so we had a data set of a certain number of Pokemon. These are all 32 by 32 pixels. And you can see from left to right, you can read these results from left to right and then go down. And so this is the first image that we're able to generate is in the upper left-hand corner. The last image is over here in the bottom right-hand corner. And over time, you see that you're starting to here put some shapes and colors together. Here in this section, we get something that looks a little more 3D. We continue on this more complicated 3D image route until we end up with something that to me looks like it could be Pokemon, although at a low resolution, and missing some features, I suppose, like facial features that would make it more recognizable. And I should mention that there are tons of tutorials for this online. So if that's something that interests you, you could access any number of them, I'm sure, to work on asset generation. So there's another interesting approach that was published in 2013 that for generating card games themselves. And the title is that first line up top towards the automatic generation, etc. And what they were doing is using evolution to evolve game rules, and really the games themselves. And so on the right-hand side, you have the ant and the grasshopper. And this is a generated game. And sort of on the left-hand side in the middle, you have the evolutionary process that this system was creating to generate these types of games. And so like I said before, it's not complete. If you think of other PCG approaches and card games that are worth mentioning, please send them my way. But I'd say that some properties that all of these games are sharing is that the cards that you select significantly impact your gameplay, that players are often needing to experiment to find the best combinations of cards. And, the experimentation is part of the joy of deck building in the first place. And there's this idea that the popular games have that net decking, which is I find a good deck and I put it online, and then other people can then look at this deck and make their decisions based off of what they see online. And so when we're talking about generating content and card games, we're thinking of things like the rules we just saw in the previous approach, the card properties like we saw in the first approach, the second approach with images. You can imagine something like that for Hearthstone, although perhaps perhaps to varying degrees of success, I suppose. But also, I'm conceptualizing and ask you to come on this journey with me that the combinations of cards in a deck are themselves procedurally generated content as well, or could be procedurally generated. Oftentimes, they are player generated, but we have worked on procedurally generating them. Excuse me, I've got a little bit of a cold. So I've been focusing on Hearthstone, and likely if you read the abstract, you'd see Hearthstone. And we've just now talked about a variety of different card games. So I think a valid question at this point would be, why Hearthstone? And so one reason is it has a lot of cards, 1,900, which is a smaller number than Magic has, but it's still a lot of cards. And it has a ton of active players. There were at least 100 million in 2018 from a link that I was able to find, players of Hearthstone. And as a result, in part because of its popularity, there are a number of different simulators that you can choose from to run the game automatically and having access to a lot of different features that you wouldn't have access to just running the client version of the game. And this simulator in particular is actively updated and maintained. So often when the new cards are coming out, the developers are working overtime to make sure that they get implemented in the simulator. So also that's maybe from like a PCG and games point of view, but it's also interesting to think about the different AI challenges that Hearthstone poses. And so we recently, the 4 of us up here, have published, so me and Julian Tegelius and two of his former students published this paper called The Many Challenges of Hearthstone, so far on archive, and they're hopefully the small edits we need to do will be done soon to get it published in KI, which is a German AI magazine. So, but anyway, there are a lot of challenges in there, and if you're interested, I suggest you check them out. But until then, let's sample a couple of them. And so we've mentioned deck building a little bit. Game playing is another big one. So deck building is which cards do I want to use for a particular game? And game playing is more like, how am I going to use these cards in a particular game? And there are also approaches that you can imagine for design tools. So inspiration for new cards, maybe something similar to the first approach that we were seeing. And something that we've done in previous papers is this game balancing and testing approach, preliminary. So I'm going to skip that overview, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about Hearthstone, and I'm going to talk about deck building and the challenges of deck building, and then move on to some of the approaches we've taken in previous papers with a specific algorithm, which we'll get into, and some of the results that we have from this approach. So I'm going to show you, I'm not sure how many people are familiar with Hearthstone, but I figured in this group, people have some familiarity. Oh, uh-oh. That's not great. Okay, let's see. So what happened is I tried to show you a video. Let's see if it wants to. Yes, excellent. So hopefully you can still see this. But what's going on over here is my hero is down here. The player hero is down here. The opponent hero is up here. It's a 2-player turn-taking adversarial card game. You can see the turn delineated by my turn. And the cards in green on the bottom that get highlighted are the ones that I have enough resource to play, which the resource is shown over, well, let's see if I could turn off these controls. The resource is shown over here for this player and down here for me when this piece goes away. And so every turn I gain, from turns 1 to 10, I gain 1 more mana, which is this in-game resource that I need to play cards. And my hand is shown below. So these, I'm not going to go down, oh, I will unfortunately, but my hand is down below and my deck is over here. And so the 30 cards that I need for a deck get stored in this area. 30 cards that the opponent has stored for a deck are here. And we're each drawing one at we're each drawing one at the start of our turn. And so you see that here that I can attack another minion. I can tell the game when my turn is over. Was hoping that we could see one of these guys. Yeah, there we go. So, and then that's how minions die, and then they'll keep attacking each other, and eventually you can see that. So the goal of the game is that my health should go from 30, where we start, down to 0, as for the opponent, his perspective, and my perspective is that he gets to 0 before me. And so our health is shown right here. And so he's at 28 at the moment, I'm at 26. And so I pulled this off of YouTube. It's a little bit more of an exciting game where the cards are more complicated. The mechanics are the same in that how we're drawing cards, how we're playing cards. We haven't talked about different types of like spells and secrets and things, but it's kind of prettier to see too. And if I fast forward a little bit, let's see. You can just see the board getting more complicated. This person clearly is having a stronger reaction to what's being played. Excuse me. So deck building in Hearthstone. There are over 1,900 cards and it's growing. And in our FDG 2018 paper, I'm not entirely sure exactly what set of cards we were looking at. I think it was 1,400 at the time. We calculated we designed a recurrence relation and ran a test to see how many possible decks that there would be, and to which we found about 6 times 10 to the 20. And so for reference on how large that number is, I should show you, there you go. For reference on how large that number is, the number of stars in our observable universe is between 1 times 10 to the 23 and 3 times 10 to the 23. And I'm showing you this video. I'm not a competitive Hearthstone player. I enjoy a lot of different aspects of the game. But you can see that my collection of cards here, we're just scrolling through. And right now we're on the third, well, now we just moved over to the fourth hero, where each hero, I didn't point out the hero's special ability and the hero's special cards, but each hero has a special ability and access to different cards than other heroes. And so with a space that big, it's interesting to see that we're looking right now at all of the top tier decks in the meta as calculated by HS Replay. And so there are 5. And sometimes there may be fewer, sometimes there may be more. You can see how it's determined below. It's the win rate within 1 standard deviation of the strongest archetype. And so this huge space is converging to like 4 or 5 top decks, and it just seems entirely like unlikely that there are not better decks that players have yet to discover. For whatever reason, whatever's holding us up, we just haven't found them yet. And obviously, or maybe not obviously if you're not that familiar with it, but the meta's changing as the cards change, the cards that you have access to and different play modes change. But it's still, to me, a very small number of decks that we converge to. And so I went through and decided to just stepwise think about how humans would build decks. And so there was one approach is you can see the 9 different heroes here. Again, each one has a special hero ability. Each one has special cards. And so it's more than just the picture that make it different, that makes these 9 different from each other. But it's also the mechanics that they have access to. So in human deck building, human building sounds interesting. The one strategy is to first pick a hero. And so you can see this mage in red over here. And then you can try, once you pick a hero on HS Replay, so this image is coming from HS Replay, you can try to pick a theme. And so that theme can be based on one card, or it can be based on a property that all of the cards share. And in this case, it is related to this card, the Mana Cyclone. And the Mana Cyclone is saying that for each spell you've cast this turn, add a random mage spell to your hand. And so you can imagine that being good at a little bit of a later stage in the game, where maybe you can play 2 or 3 or 4, depending on how ambitious or how lucky you're getting in this game, spells. You play those spells, and then you play this card. And that means that you get a bunch of new cards with new abilities that occupy your hand for the next turn. So it's a card that's compelling and makes sense why it would be interesting to players and why it would be successful. And so here's some different gameplay strategies. So remember, deck building is figuring out which subset of cards are we going to select for the subset. And the gameplay strategy excuse me, is figuring out which cards to play when. So of the 30 that we have in Hearthstone, when do I play these guys and how do I play them? Because you could see even in the initial video that there are choices we have. And so then after going through these steps, we start adding cards. And so a reminder of the different cards you can add. We have our theme card that we more or less looked at in step 2, and we have class cards that support it. So this is what's called a spell card. It's not a minion that goes on the board, but it's an effect that it has. Well, actually, we'll ignore that factor. So spell cards can be played, and they're an effect that happens. It's not necessarily that there's a minion that needs to be on the board. So it's not just this card either. You might want to add a couple other cards that are special to the mage that we've selected that are low cost and will complement the theme. Also, maybe some neutral cards to counter any unforeseen issues with other heroes trying to, say, equip a weapon, and now all of a sudden they have their weapon equipped and you'd like to have them get rid of it. And so this card, a neutral card that everybody has access to, will disarm them. And so maybe there's a situation where you just want to beat your friends. And so we'll say that this guy on the left over here is going to play a shaman, and the guy on the right wants to play a druid, and we play all the time. So I know that these are their 2 particular heroes, and they like trying out different decks. So this is a different strategy for humans to build decks, perhaps less popular, but there are a lot of modifications and ways that people do this. So one is that you can look at the decks, the top decks on HS Replay. This is more of like a net decking approach. But you see up here, you have win rate, games, length. So win rate is just how often it wins, the amount of data they have for these particular decks, the time it takes for the game to finish. And this right here is what's called the mana curve, which is reflecting the cost of the cards in the player's deck. And so the cards are over here on the right, and the class and the cost it would take me to build the entire deck is also over here. So here, for instance, you see Paladin, and this particular deck would cost me a lot of this dust resource to build. So let's pick a strategy, or let's pick a feature rather, and we'll go ahead and pick curve. And so with curve, these are two common ways of thinking about gameplay strategy. One is aggro, which is I'm going to do a lot of damage quickly early on in the game. And the other is control, where, yeah, I still want to do damage early on, but what's more important is maintaining control of the board, not letting the opponent beat me. And so not letting the opponent really put things out on the board that can then overtake. So control is more about what it sounds like, controlling the board. So down here you have, I wish this mouse would move. There we go. So down here you have these mana crystals, and the height of this line up here is reflecting how many cards in the 30 card deck are of 3 mana, or 2 mana depending, and it's the same for the control. So let's go ahead and say that we're selecting by mana curve. So, and we know that we want something that will beat our friends, the shaman and the druid. So let's say we like this curve, and let's go ahead and check out this deck. And so the mana curve on HS Replay, the mana curve is already plotted out and available for us. We see we've chosen a paladin hero, so we didn't necessarily pick paladin first like we did in the other deck building strategy. And we can see over here, if we remember, we have the shaman and the druid that our friends are playing. We can see the win rate generally against different types of decks that correspond to different heroes. So each one of these icons corresponds to a different hero type. And you can't see the icon on this, but the shaman is here and the druid is up top. So it looks like our deck that we've selected, if we choose to use this deck, will perform well against a druid deck on average, and it might struggle with a shaman. So maybe we would want to pick a couple of shaman specific cards, just in hopes that we would be able to have better success against our friend and whatever crazy deck that he's come up with. And so in Hearthstone, hopefully with these two examples, I've started to show you that players are often looking, whether or not they're articulating it, they're looking for decks with certain characteristics. Sometimes it's a cool card. Sometimes it's some interesting combination. Sometimes it's as practical as the cost of building them. So can I afford to play it? How many turns does it take to win? How long do the turns take? And so the types of cards are a little jargony, but what types of cards do I really want to be playing? And what are the win rates? Like, the win rates still matter. I don't want to be deck building crappy decks, as in I likely don't want to be building crappy decks. The decks can be interesting. And so quality diversity, you may be somewhat familiar with it at this point. I think the next speaker, Yorios, has just released a paper that is some sort of survey for the approach and advocation, I suppose, also for the approach in PCG. So I haven't read it yet, though. I'm sorry, but I'll read it soon. And I believe that's what it is, though. And it seems very interesting. But generally, quality diversity is an algorithm that is looking for diverse sets of solutions that vary in different dimensions. Like we were just talking about, I think I can go back easily. So these here, you can consider the different dimensions maybe of what I care about in Hearthstone. And this is an example. There are many, many more. Great. So we're looking for good solutions, variety of dimensions. Well, even though it was originally proposed in 2015, this algorithm, and it was originally used for things like robot locomotion and maze navigation. And even though digital games have a variety of successful strategies and dimensions along which these solutions can vary, we looked just at Hearthstone, but you can imagine many more, that we haven't really seen an explosion yet of quality diversity algorithms. And so here's the paper that I was talking about first, the procedural content generation through quality diversity, which looks very interesting and is available on arXiv. It just did not include the link. And another approach, which is one of the first for generating content, like PCG content, with map elites. And there are several more that have been published this year, but we're just beginning to see it as an approach. And so the goal for the rest of what I'm going to present here is, is there a way, when we first started, we weren't really sure that we would be able to generate decks in a meaningful way that would improve with their algorithm because of the enormous amount of time that it takes to run games, although now we have cluster access, so it's a lot easier to run. There's so much stochasticity, though, that we often are running between 200 and 400 of these games to get a win rate even. So every deck that we generate, we need to test for win rate. And so we're hoping that we have we being my research team, proposed a slight variation of map elites that I'm going to talk about today. So you'll get an overview that will hopefully help you in the future read about this algorithm. But we have a slight variation on it to fit it to our domain of generating Hearthstone decks. And we then we're looking at decks, or we'll look at some experiments with decks, and we'll look at game balance with this diverse set of decks. And so first, this is the 2018 paper. We were looking at an opponent decks, excuse me, they were built of basic cards, and the player also had access to basic cards, but only basic cards. And so you can imagine these likely aren't decks that you would want to be playing and building yourself at the moment, but we wanted to just see, can these decks get better over time? And we played them against what we ended up calling the starter decks. And the starter decks, in this case, are what you would get when you finish the Hearthstone tutorial. So cards that everybody has access to once they have the full version of the game. And so we selected the Hunter, the Paladin, and the Warlock because we were using the built-in Aggro score function inside of Saberstone to run these games. And we see that, okay, well, fitness is here on the left. That's just the evaluation. How good is this deck and the win rate? Or you could consider it the win rate. It's slightly different, but if you lose nothing if you think about it as win rate. And the number of generations that we ran on the x-axis. And so for all of these, we see that they increase over time. And we take the top performing decks out of these generations and to get the mana curve. And remember, we're looking at an aggro strategy. These mana curves all look somewhat reasonable for the top performing decks to be using, which is some validation. And this paper talks about it goes into the properties of different cards and different decks a little bit deeper, like for instance, the transitivity, but I'm gonna skip over that. Feel free to read the paper if you are interested in a little more of that. So, okay, but what about, we just made a big deal about searching for decks with specific characteristics. So we show right now briefly that, okay, we found higher performing decks that they got better over time. And we saw that their mana curves were matching with the gameplay strategy, the aggro strategy. So what about what about the characteristics that we were talking about before? And so now I'm going to take you on a journey where, now let's pretend that a Hearthstone deck only has 4 cards. And so this is going to be, for the sake of illustration, our deck. And you can see the mana cost over here in the upper left. You can see the attack power of the minion on the bottom left, and you can see the health of the minion in the bottom right. And so this is repeating the idea we went over earlier with more text. And you can see that, that again, aggro, the type of the cards are, there are way more here for aggro than there are here. And so with our example deck, we have a few things to start with at first. So we have this buffer, and map elites, there are a few different versions of map elites, and the terminology will differ. But part of the uniqueness of this approach was keeping track of all of the, or part of the way it was able to work, I really should say, was keeping track, of all the individuals that we had ever been able to create. So this is D1, deck 1. It's been run 200 games against we'll say the same opponent, and it's won 100 out of those 200 games. And so once it's evaluated, it gets put in this buffer, which is marked D1, and you can see the fitness as 100. And so in map elites, you are looking for things that vary along these behavioral dimensions. So what matters to you is that two things, is that you have decks that are performing well, but you also have decks that are performing well at different, at different points in this space down here and over here. And so what we decided to do to start with, although we initially wanted to look at all of these, and we're still interested, and there's code available if anybody who's listening is interested in running some of these experiments with us, or just actually running them either way. But we tried to estimate mana curve, and we did that by looking at average mana cost and the variance of average mana of the deck and the variance of the deck average. So here we have average mana cost. We've calculated as 2.5, and down here we have variance as calculated as 1.25. We get a behavior vector, which is just a place where that deck maps into space. And since there's nothing in that space, we go ahead and we put that deck in there. So, okay, now we have a different deck, but we're repeating the same process. So we evaluate D2. We see its fitness is not great. It's 80 out of 200. And we see that it has a lot of high-cost cards. So it's not surprising then that we have a higher average mana, a lower variance, because you can see that the variance is very small. And the behavior vector here is something that we haven't plotted yet. So we go ahead, nothing else is occupying this cell. So only one deck can be in a cell at a time. And so nothing else is there. And so we put D2 there, and now we're on to D3. D3 is back in the buffer. It's been evaluated over 200 games. It has a fitness of 150. We go through, we plot the point, but there's a hitch. So there's something already occupying this cell in this map of elites. And what we do in the case of having some sort of no vacancy issue is we look at the fitness between what we are trying to put in the map and the fitness of what's already there. And we see that D3 is going to replace D1 because its fitness is higher. So this is an abstraction, if you will, of kind of what we would want with map elites. We want, if it's not possible to have all the cells full of these high performing decks, you definitely want decks along, the whole point was we want decks that vary along these different dimensions of both average mana cost and variance. But we were finding, and part of why we added this modification to map elites, what we call sliding boundaries, is that this is really what we were getting. And there are reasons for it. One is that in standard map elites, you are sort of required to set the lower and upper boundaries either based on your knowledge of where they can be, which can be really difficult and to calculate in some cases. So for instance, the number of turns that a Hearthstone, maybe Hearthstone is set, but if you don't know the upper bound and the lower bound, it would be hard to set them. And then additionally, you don't necessarily want to be exploring that entire space right off the bat. So that was one way. So one way of, by adding in these individuals here, we were able to instead set the boundaries based on the lowest value, so the behavior vector value, that and the highest behavior vector value that we had seen. And there was another alteration here in the way that we were drawing these bends. And so in this image here, you can see they're uniformly separated, they're the same size, and they're not moving. But here, this is an image with one behavior characteristics. So we were looking at an image with two behavior characteristics. This one has one, with standard map elites on the left and map elites with sliding boundaries on the right. And that green there is indicating the percentages of individuals that would, that have in the buffer, that have that, that number, the behavior of that would lie in the map of elite space, basically. So there's a higher density over here of individuals with a, whatever this behavior vector of 2 is. There are a lot of individuals around here. And so, and these two, right. So here we focus on splitting up that area where there's high density, and where there's low density, we spread it out. And so that's another core part of the variation that we have added to map elites is this sliding, I would say, along that dimension. So our experiments were done in Saberstone, which I mentioned earlier, which is a Hearthstone simulator. It's actively maintained, and if you're interested, it's available at this GitHub link, but you should be able to just type in Saberstone and find the GitHub pretty quickly. The agents are operating on a turn local game tree search, which you can imagine is very limiting. And the states are evaluated with a scoring function. In this case, for the experiments, we're running a scoring function that comes prepackaged with the simulator itself. Oops. And so with this, so this is coming from the Map Elites with Sliding Boundaries paper, but we wanted to see, so we did a validation experiment to test that we could evolve decks, and we sort of just glossed over the details of that experiment, and but we saw that, okay, we can generate decks. But, excuse me, now we're also going to need to validate this approach, MESB. So can it generate a high variety of decks across different mana distributions? And are these decks being generated across mana curves that we would expect? So if you recall, those are two behavior characteristics that we cared a lot about. We broke them down into two, but we're trying to approximate mana curve. And the idea being that one approach to deck building would be to first look at mana curve before deciding what sorts of cards you would like to have in your deck. And so for the validation experiment, we were working with the starter decks, which I mentioned earlier are the cards you have at the end of a tutorial. And we were evolving decks with MESB, and we were looking at aggro and control this time rather than just aggro. And so our second experiment is looking at, can we evolve? So the starter decks, like I mentioned before, are relatively, they're not the weakest sorts of decks you can have, but they're certainly not powerful. Can we evolve against the decks that we evolved previously and still continue to do better? And so that would look, the opponents were the decks evolved with the experiment 1, and the new decks evolved with MESB were played against those. And so we did some preliminary experimentation to explore whether or not it's a promising tool for game balancing, although there's a lot that can be done in this area. And so what we do is calculate the most and least common cards in the decks of map elites, see if we can nerf and buff them, and then rerun the experiment to see how well they perform and who uses them. So if I've nerfed a powerful card, you sort of expect it not, perhaps, I mean, it's complicated and we've seen various results, but you might expect it not to be used as much just naively because it's not as powerful as it used to be, and it still costs the same, or maybe it even costs more. And or buff the card, you'd expect people to take advantage of and by people, I mean these deck building algorithms. You would expect that maybe they could take advantage of the card and the buff, and it would perform better and be used more. So here's a scatter plot of what we're seeing with the Hunter, and the Paladin and Warlock are listed here, and the aggro and control are listed here. And so each one of these is showing the fitness of the individuals in the map of elites, which is that grid we were looking at. And so the darker the color, the higher the fitness. The lighter the color, the lower the fitness. And what that means is that dark colored decks performed well, whereas light colored decks did not. And you see that for aggro, you would expect that you would have lower average mana, and you would have some level of variance that's not too like impossibly low, but it's also not too high. And we start to, these ones are not standardized. I'm not sure if I have the axes aren't standardized, but you'll be able to see that in the video. But it's interesting that we do see that we have darker aggro strategies over in this area. We have lighter strategies that aren't performing as well. With the hunter, a lot of the deck, or a paladin rather, sorry. This was the hunter, this is a paladin. A lot of the decks were performing well, but you can still tell it's an aggro strategy because this sort of drop off over here and you get too high up and the hue's not as dark as it is in this special spot. And similar for the warlock. And so what we see with control is, first of all, it looks like a lot more. I didn't explain the adding cells. Hopefully we'll be able to see it. But the adding cells to map elites as well as we go along. But we did that as well. And so there are more individuals in the map of elites here with the hunter, paladin, and warlock. And it's hard to see in this image, but let's see if the next one's there. It's a little bit easier to see in this one where the axes are standardized, that this idea that, excuse me, that control is darker in more areas than the aggro. And so to answer our question, can map elites with sliding boundaries generate a high variety of decks across different mana distributions? We end up with a map of elites that looks like a bunch of boxes, I suppose, at first glance, and it honestly is. But what we can see by looking at this is the color here is inverted. Different people are working on these different images, where the darker the color is, the lower the fitness. And so we see that the aggro hunter is terrible, and that's at the end. And you can see that the aggro paladin is pretty good, but darker than the control paladin. And the aggro warlock is good, but darker than the aggro paladin. And you can see this is the lightest one, indicating that it had the highest fitness. And so I took out the other videos for ease of presenting this, but we can see the map of elites growing over time. So this is one of the worst performers. In fact, all the aggro strategies didn't perform as well as the control strategies. And you can see these decks getting added to the map and their fitnesses. You can't see the numbers there, but the darker color, remember, is lower fitness. And here you can see the paladin map also growing, but getting lighter. And so that's aggro hunter and control paladin. Oops. So, okay, but what about, can map elites with sliding boundaries evolve strategies to counter the good ones that we presumably just found? Well, we saw that the fitness was lower, the number itself, but you'd imagine that because now instead of starter decks, we're looking at decks that are more challenging and that have gone through this evolution process. And like I said, the control strategy tended to be better than the aggro strategy. And even though I wanted to mention, the wording's confusing, but the decks that had lower fitness in the second experiment were run against the decks in the first experiment, and all of the second decks beat the first decks, which you would expect, and we saw that control was outperforming its aggro counterpart. So here are the distributions we have for aggro and control for the second experiment, and here just some similar, they look at this point similar. If we compared them side by side to the other one, they're a little bit darker, but we're finding again a little bit lighter because, well, no, darker because we're looking at the fitness. So, right. And you just see each one of these squares is representing an individual deck. And so finally, we're almost there. We took a preliminary look at game balancing. We saw that we took a look at the cards with the most and least occurrences in the deck, and we nerfed the guys in red and we buffed the guys in green. So over here, you can see that we nerfed these cards by increasing the mana cost. And although interestingly, that's also going to increase the properties of the deck itself that we're measuring, the average mana sum and the variance, potentially. And for this Sunwalker, it was the attack power was reduced. And so these were chosen because of how prevalent they were in the map of elites. And these two cards, if you're familiar with Hearthstone, the Silverback Patriarch is just sort of hilariously terrible because it keeps getting replaced with better and better cards in Hearthstone. So we tried to make it a little bit better with this attack power here, and the Master Swordsmith wasn't being used much, so we also gave it 2 health. And so with this image, you can see that's separated by the Hunter, Paladin, and Warlock, and the Aggro and Control. And you can see the pre-nerf, pre-buff amount that was being used up top here, and then afterwards you can see what happens down here. And so this is measuring occurrence across the map of elites, the decks and map of elites. And so at first, this Earthen Ring Farseer, who we ended up increasing its mana cost by 2, had it was used in 96.5% of the Aggro Hunter decks. And it was used in a large number of these Paladin Aggro and Control decks. And you can see after the nerf that it's not being used anymore. And sort of reverse of that is interesting for this explosive shot with Hunter, where the explosive shot is nerfed by adding 2 mana, but is now being used more often. Argent Squire didn't seem to have much of an impact over here, and in this case, usage went down. And I just want to, before we don't have to go through all of these, but the Silverback Patriarch here was only used by the Aggro Hunter to start with. Nobody else was touching it. And after increasing the attack by 2 for the Silverback Patriarch, everybody else started using it, and our hipster hunters stopped using it. And so Explosive Shot is a hunter class card, so when you're reading this, be careful to not look too into the fact that these guys aren't using it. But we have an idea about why that usage increased, which is, if we look, it does 5 damage to a minion and 2 damage to adjacent ones. So really, this card is best used later in the game, and by forcing its mana by forcing the game to have been going on for longer, it's likely that this card, we'll have to measure this at some point, it's likely that this card is being used at a more appropriate place when it can do more damage than it had been at when it cost 5. And so with the Silverback Patriarch, it's possible that there's something like that going on, but it's less obvious. It's also just possible that the mana curve is affected when, this is just attack. So it looks like that the attack power made it a more powerful card. So the conclusion for that set of experiments and that approach is that map elites with sliding boundaries seems to be solving problems that are a specific subset of problems. And not only should you maybe consider using map elites, but potentially this sliding boundaries idea as well. It's sort of speaks to the power of Hearthstone itself as a benchmarking domain, in that, like many domains, that you have to sort of adapt your algorithms to fit what you have. And so already we have something that we're hoping is applicable beyond Hearthstone, and it seems like it will be. And we saw that it's capturing a diversity of quality decks for aggro and control players, and this is a first look into some of these sort of experiments, but a potential tool for game content designers. And so recently my team has started looking into, if you've noticed, we use mostly basic and classic cards in those experiments, but that was related to a hardware problem on our end, and we have fixed that and are ready to start trying to generate decks that we can then compare to the meta. And something that was suggested to me at Gecko was to try and take, which is interesting, is to try and take a deck from the meta and try taking one of the legendary cards, changing it slightly, and see how well it performed both before and after. But it's important to consider that these decks are not evolving in some sort of vacuum, that the way they play it is really, that the way the decks are played is really important too. And we have a few different initiatives to try and improve the controller. So the game tree itself is turn local, which isn't going to help with long-term planning. The So it's going to always struggle with that. The scoring function, after doing these experiments, looking at the scoring function, the aggro scoring function is not actively incentivizing the warlock to use the warlock hero power, because the warlock's hero power is due to damage to itself to then draw a card, but drawing that card is never rewarded, and taking that damage is penalized. And so there's still a lot of work to be done in both deck building and in game playing, and really as a content tool for game designers. And so I think I'm starting to talk way too much, but I'm gonna leave it at that, and I'm supposed to open the Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. Otherwise, we can just get started with the next presenter. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to start with the first one I see, and I think I just hit answer live. Obviously, I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm sorry with with this interface, but hopefully I'll repeat the question. Yes, I will. So there are two questions coming from one person. Do you have to get in contact with Blizzard to work with their IPs? So they have not. I'll answer that one first. It's they haven't shut down the simulators, and we haven't had an issue with them. We have wanted to potentially do more collaboratively and potentially design some sort of competition, although there is a competition now, but it's not Blizzard sanctioned. It was running last year at Conference on Games, and I'm not sure if it is this year, but we haven't been contacted by them yet, so I hope not. It's the first one. The second you're asking is the increase in fire shot, the nerf that began to be used. So we had increased its mana. Could it be to counter the Patriarch and the other buffed one? I'm not sure what the other buffed one is, but I understand your question. And that's another, there's so much to look at here. So potentially, yes, that could be it, but it's hard to say without looking at all of the decks and running some sort of analysis. And we were doing this, we were just asking separate questions. But by doing more analysis, we could try to get to the bottom of that, and that could be some, its own publication somewhere. But I suspect it could be related to that without knowing, though, and looking at the results. But it also might just be, I'm really starting to doubt, even though we're getting interesting looking aggro-ish, control-ish results with the scoring function, I have a sneaking suspicion it's going to get a lot better as some of these game playing approaches we're working on make it into production for us. Okay, so I'm going to move on. So if you have more questions, like follow-up questions to that, let me know, but I'm going to hit done on this thing. Does the system model other players when considering deck builds? Not at all. And so you can imagine that also being something to consider when you're building decks, and not just other players, but even the most commonly occurring cards and different decks and different archetypes. Without having, so there's a data set on Kaggle.com, which is called, what is it called? It has a bunch of different Hearthstone decks, and potentially you could do something with what's coming out of HS for Replay. I just haven't actually messed with it. But you can get a lot of information about what's going on in the meta and try to ask, like, what are the most important cards that we're trying to sort of schedule the rest of our deck around. And then once we make that decision, how well do we add in those extra guys? So for instance, in this example that we're looking at with the Cyclone card, the Cyclone Mage, can we build a deck to fit that specification? So we're looking at deck building with map elites from this perspective of mana curve, but we could look at it from the perspective of mana curve and force the condition that it includes that deck. So no, it's not modeling the other players, but that would be really interesting. Oops. Hopefully you heard that. Did you also try traditional map elites? How did it work? So No, we ran out of time to do validation approaches with regular map elites, but that's a good question, and it raises a lot of question about the nature of sliding boundaries. And so part of what we were concerned about, I didn't show you these results. So there's no clear way that you that you would know this, but we were comparing to what my student was calling the true distribution, but he's able to calculate and visualize the true distribution of decks. So all the possible combinations of different mana sums and variances. And we were able to, what we were concerned about is with our sliding boundaries is that they would be biasing the search in a way that was meaning that we weren't exploring the same amount of space, as we would be exploring with different algorithms and or with regular map elites. So the idea in regular map elites is there's some sort of selection pressure that's forcing the individual to evolve into these new. This is very generally speaking, but forcing these individuals to move cells. And so, but we saw that it was sampling broadly across the space of the true distribution of mana sum and the average mana sum and the variance. So we were able, the one problem we thought we would have with this approach, we were able to take a look at by choosing and this gets into, I don't know, the evolutionary computation background of everybody, but by sort of reducing the behavior space to the phenotype space, we were able to calculate that easy. And that's part of why we also, so there were multiple reasons why we chose mana curve, and that happens to be one of them to double check that what was going on with our sliding boundaries. But I would very much like to try traditional map elites. It's just that these experiments, as you can imagine, take a bit of time to run, and hopefully if you're considering such a thing, you have access to an HPC, a cluster of different computers. I also did not hit answer live there. Hopefully, okay, this time I've got it. Okay, so what is your opinion on using MESB to generate a diversity of weapons or spells on an arena style game? What would be the main challenges behind that? Yeah, okay. Well, with arena, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I often really enjoy the different versions of the game. I'm not a super competitive player, but from the few that I've played, you're building your deck yourself, and or you have these suggestions. You're obviously not building an entire deck, but you're going along and you're building this deck yourself. And I think it could be a recommendation system possibly. And so looking at these different options you have, what might be I mean, ideally, this is not necessarily map elites, but maybe something in the future that we could select cards that are going well with the cards that you are choosing through Arena. But also, I mean, one of the really cool things about Arena is all the data, and I'm sure you know this based on your question, but for other people maybe not as familiar, like all the data that you have from the meta is really mostly based on Arena. That's what people tend to care about and get competitive about. And so you can imagine a lot of different data analysis approaches being more accurate in an Arena style game than, say, a wild format play against another player or some sort of Tavern Brawl. So I'm not positive that gets to the heart of what you're asking, but I'd be happy to chat more about it. Have you approached Hearthstone deck builders to evaluate your best builds? That's a good question. And so I'm not sure if you mean, oh, I see you guys were saying something. Excellent. So did you hear me respond to the other two questions that I didn't hit the answer live button, or no? Okay, you did mean human builders. Okay, great. I just started to get worried there for a second. Okay, so no, we have not. But there is a problem that we're only looking at these basic and classic cards, although I think that really good players would still have intuition about this. And as you know, some of these basic and classic cards are still used in really competitive decks, but maybe not all basic and classic cards. But it would be really interesting to approach some. Hopefully, I hadn't thought of that actually. just contacting them through YouTube. I think when we get this final approach, generating decks and gameplay strategies simultaneously, I'm hoping that this is going to be better than the decks that we have. Something I forgot to mention is that you can see that we're getting insanely high, let me see, insanely high win rates. And so I'll show you the first one. Let me go back here. Yeah, I think it is the same. I think they have intuitive theories for good decks. But I think that also is part of the limitation of human deck building, and part of why we are always converging to these singular, not single, I mean, they're like 4 or 5 solutions. Also the way competitive decks to the, I forget who had the other question, but also it's adapted to arena mode, and oftentimes, yeah, so I'll let that idea go. But I want to show you this. Hold on, here we go. If you look up here, you're seeing, granted, you're evolving like what's presumably a better deck against a really crappy starter deck, but like a 90-something% win rate is extremely high. That's something that you don't often see in the meta. And if you were to go, I haven't tested this idea, but if you go to the meta and HS replay, I don't know what the lowest is you're going to find, but perhaps the assumption with the meta is that most of these decks that have made it that far are generally thought to be good, and a lot of the decks that and they're not playing against these starter decks. So I really like that idea, Philip, of approaching Hearthstone deck builders. And if you have any more suggestions about who you think might be appropriate, again, feel free to just message me and we could contact them, and how they evaluate each other's decks. Yeah, right. Okay, I'm going to hit done on this, and I think it's time for Yorios. Thank you guys very much. I really enjoyed putting this together. Excellent. And so let me just type this in real fast in case you want to follow up with anything. Feel free to send me an email, and I'll be happy to either explain anything that we talked about or answer your question in more detail or whatever. Anyway, thank you guys very much, and I am going to mute myself now and stop sharing my screen.